Good afternoon, and welcome to today's reality check session, Why Passing OT Pen Tests Still Gets Organizations Breached. Across critical infrastructure sectors, we continue to see the same troubling pattern. Organizations invest in testing, receive clean reports, document accepted risk, and secure executive sign-off, only to experience operationally disruptive incidents days, weeks, or months later. The issue isn't negligence. It's a fundamental mismatch between what traditional OT penetration testing is designed to validate and how modern industrial attacks actually unfold. Today, we're going to challenge that model. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and joining me today are Terry McCorkle, CEO and founder of PhishCloud, and Chris Weule, Director of Operational Technology, Cyber Fusion, and Strategy. Terry brings an executive and strategic perspective shaped by years of working with boards and industrial leaders navigating IT and OT risk. Chris brings deep hands-on adversarial experience, modeling how sophisticated attackers move through trusted paths, pivot across IT and OT boundaries, and remain undetected until impact occurs. Together, they're going to walk us through why exploit validation does not equal resilience, why detection is the real failure point in most OT incidents, and how organizations can shift from report-driven security to operationally validated readiness. Our goal today is simple: moving beyond passing tests and toward proving that your organization can actually see, stop, and contain real attacks before operations are impacted. So let's get started. Gentlemen, the stage is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chris Weile, and I'll be joined by my colleague, Terry McCorkle, as we walk through this critical topic today.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Today, we're going to challenge some conventional thinking around OT security, and I look forward to this being an interesting conversation.
Absolutely. Before we dive in, just a quick housekeeping note. We've got about 30 minutes together today. We'll cover the material for about 26 minutes or so. Then we'll save 3 or 4 minutes at the end for your questions. So please feel free to drop in questions as we go through the chat, and we'll address them at the end. All right, so let me set the stage here with what we're calling the dangerous assumption. Organizations across critical infrastructure sectors are facing a really troubling paradox. They invest in security testing. They receive clean pen testing reports. They implement the recommended fixes, and yet they still experience devastating breaches that impact all operations. What we're going to examine today is the fundamental gap between traditional pen test approaches and the realities of operational technology security. Our goal is to challenge conventional thinking about OT security validation, because understanding this gap is truly the first step toward building resilient OT security programs that can withstand real-world attacks.
Thanks, Chris. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. We keep hearing these stories from organizations that say we've passed our pen test, usually done for some kind of compliance, and yet they still get a breach, and the breach can be quite expensive. So across post incidents and doing analysis across multiple industry sectors, we see that organizations with OT are experiencing a significant increase in the attacks, and specifically the attacks that happen after they've already done pen testing. They've done what they were supposed to do. So these organizations weren't negligent. They maintained and documented their vulnerabilities. They obtained executive leadership buy-off. But really, what is it that is causing these residual risks? So let me break down what we're actually seeing in these organizations, that they had passed recent pen tests conducted within 6 to 12 months. They documented the vulnerabilities and knew about the risk. The executives signed off. And the critical insight really that we're seeing is passing a pen test does not equal resilience. The pattern we're seeing isn't that they're negligent. It's a fundamental model problem on how they're approaching OT security validation. And that's what we're going to be digging into today.
All right, let me add some context here, because I think understanding the original purpose of pen testing helps clarify where it succeeds and where it falls short in operational environments. Pen tests excel at three things. First, technical control assessment, validating whether security controls function as designed. Second, exploit validation, proving that specific vulnerabilities are actually exploitable within an environment, not just theoretical. And third, compliance evidence, supporting audit requirements and regulatory frameworks. These are valuable functions, don't get me wrong, but here's what pen tests don't cover, and this is critical. They don't model sophisticated attacker behavior patterns. They don't test detection capabilities and response procedures. They don't validate IT to OT pivot paths and trust relationships. They don't simulate the attack sequences that take place over time. They don't evaluate the organizational response under pressure. And here's the thing, these gaps represent the exact areas where real attacks succeed.
So, as Chris just outlined, what a pen test do and don't do, let me talk about the hidden assumptions that are really there and baked into a traditional OT pen test. The assumption is if it's exploitable, it's dangerous. And in a traditional pen test where they're focused on an application or something like that, this makes sense. But in an OT environment, identifying and validating those exploitable vulnerabilities doesn't necessarily show what that path will be. So this assumption misses critical dimensions of how the attacks actually unfold in an industrial environment. So let me give you a few areas where it's actually missing. First, from an attack sequence, the real breach follows a multi-staged progressional attack. And it looks at not just the primary system, but secondary systems and system dependencies. You need to understand which systems you should trust and which systems trust each other, but also understand how those failures will cascade through those interconnected operations. Third area is those trust relationships that we just touched on. And that is, these are the connections between IT and OT that an attacker will use that enables legitimate access as well. So when we're looking at attacker paths in an OT environment, we look at those trust relationships. And the fourth area is human behavior and how engineers and administrators actually use the system under normal or stressed conditions. And the bottom line is attackers don't exploit vulnerabilities, they exploit those trust paths as attackers do. Sorry, there we go. So let me show you what a typical attack path or attack chain actually looks like. From an initial compromise, understanding how it initially happens and then understanding how these breach origins really reveals why traditional pen testing misses the mark. Real attacks rarely begin where a pen test focuses. So let's go through kind of the 5 steps in a typical attack chain. Step 1 is that initial compromise. This is usually a phishing or credential theft, something that may have been found on the internet, but they use OSINT and other areas to understand your organization and target the right people who have OT access or who have IT access that can easily lead to OT access. The second step is that trust exploitation. They're going to use that, the attacker is going to use those legitimate credentials to access things through VPNs, or perhaps they gain access to an engineering workstation. That's how we always did it, is you get access to an engineering workstation, which gives you jump hosts and a lot of information. And then from there, the lateral movement, it uses standard protocols that administrator or that workstation user actually uses. And so the tools actually look and appear completely normal. Step 4 is actually accessing those OT environments. Once they've reached those operational systems, it's about understanding and the actual operations, how they rely on each other, and not just the exploits of an exotic OT vulnerability. Step 5 is impact execution. So if a real attacker's there, they're not going to necessarily look for just exploiting one vulnerability. They'll look for a system that gives them the biggest effect. And so they basically are only after the trust and look to abuse that to cause the disruption. Now, here is the critical gap. And what I want to emphasize on this, most of the attack chains never appear in a standard pen test report. The focus on OT specific vulnerability completely misses the IT OT pathways where breaches actually succeed.
Okay, so Terry's laid out the problem pretty clearly. Now let me talk about a different approach, red team assessments, and why it's fundamentally different from pen testing in the OT context. First, let's be clear. Red team does not equal pen test. Red team assessments represent a fundamentally different approach to security validation. Rather than proving that vulnerabilities are exploitable, red teaming simulates adversary behavior to reveal how your organization would actually respond to a sophisticated attack. This methodology provides insights that traditional pen testing simply cannot deliver. It focuses on the operational dimensions of security rather than the purely technical control validation. Let me break down what red teaming assessments give you. First, they give you attack path discovery. They reveal realistic routes through your environment, including those critical IT to OT pivots that Terry was just talking about. Second, attacker behavior simulation. Red team assessments model how real adversaries think, move, and adapt, not just which exploits work, but where within your environment they could live off the land. Third, you get detection validation. A red team assessment tests whether your organization can actually see attacks happening across the IT environment and the OT environment, and directly between those pivot points in the OT to IT side. Do you have east-west detection? Are you actually looking at IT or OT segments so that you can see if something abnormal is happening? And then fourth, response assessment. A red team assessment evaluates escalation procedures and cross-team coordination under realistic pressure. Does a team inside of your environment elevate things when they discover something?
So why do pen tests actually miss this chain that we were just talking about? It's not about poor execution. It's about the structural limitations and inherent to the methodology itself. The security operations centers are often very reactive. The constraints that make pen testing safe and practical are the same constraints that prevent it from providing that realistic attack and showing how it unfolds. So let me walk through some of these limitations. First, they're asset focused. Typically, if you're doing a test, you're looking at an individual system, individual asset, rather than how the trust flows around that asset. And a lot of the operational constraints that are there. So pen testers must, they need to test and avoid disruption in production, which could potentially create safety risks. So the testing is often scoped differently. And that's reasonable. I admit you have to be careful around those OT systems. But the second area is those operational constraints that really are there for those pen testers. Third is the fragile system and protecting it. They can't exploit a legacy OT system that might fail in the testing. Again, that's understandable. But the fourth area, and really this is kind of the key point, it is a point in time assessment that tests a single moment, a single attack vector, or a more traditional application style assessment, while actual attacks actually appear over time and have extended periods of time. So there's safety boundaries to consider. The testing is exactly where real attackers cause the most damage. So attackers now just operate with different constraints. They take their time. They're not necessarily concerned about the safety, but they don't want to give themselves up. They'll exploit fragile systems, or they don't necessarily exploit the fragile systems until they absolutely want to show an effect. Instead, they'll focus on those trust relationships, pivoting between things and maintaining that visibility. So it's a fundamental mismatch when you're talking about a pen test that can't actually reveal the true exposure.
All right. So let me talk about where an attack or a breach will actually succeed, because it's not where most people think. Post-incident analysis consistently reveals that technical exploitation is the critical failure. Detection is the critical failure, not the technical exploitation. So organizations fail to identify attacks in progress until operational impacts occur. And by that time, containment becomes significantly more difficult. Let me show you how this plays out from different perspectives. From the IT perspective, attacker activity appears as normal administrator behavior. Credential use, remote access, system management, all these things are things you should expect. They're normal in your environment, and they all look legitimate. From the OT perspective, network traffic uses expected industrial protocols. The protocols that we all know are inherently insecure, making malicious commands indistinguishable from routine operations. From the SOC perspective, security operations centers see nothing actionable. Events don't trigger alerts or correlate into incidents because you don't action against someone logging in. That's a normal credential use. From the OT team's perspective, operational teams aren't notified until physical impact manifests, and that's far too late for effective response. Now, traditional pen tests rarely assess detection capabilities. They validate whether vulnerabilities are exploitable, not whether your organization can identify the attack in progress. And attackers depend on this detection gap. The longer they can remain undetected, the deeper their access becomes, and the more options they have for causing impact while they live off the land. The average dwell time once an attacker gets into an environment is about 187 days. So they have plenty of time to go ahead and get deeper into the systems. So here's the critical question everyone should be asking. If your environment were compromised right now, how long would it take for you to know? Most organizations can't answer this with confidence. Think of red teaming assessments as a fire drill for your security program, not a structural inspection. It reveals how your people, your processes, and your technology perform together when facing a real threat, so that you know when something happens that will be properly escalated and actioned against. Now, here's a mistake we see all the time, and it's a big one. Most organizations test before they're ready. One of the most common mistakes in OT security programs is conducting penetration testing before establishing foundational capabilities. This creates risk without delivering actionable insights. It turns a security assessment into paper theater rather than a genuine risk reduction. Let me give you 3 examples of what not ready looks like. First, if the organization has no IT to OT visibility, you cannot see the traffic flows between an enterprise and the operational networks. You're not ready. Second, no identity correlation. You cannot connect a user account to an OT system access and its activities. Generally speaking, we see lots of OT systems where we have a single HMI and a single login, and everyone shares the same login. Third, no incident response capability. You cannot respond to security events without halting production operations. And if you can't respond to the event, then you're not really ready to go ahead and start testing. What's the point of having a test that you can't respond to? If you lack these capabilities, what happens when you do a pen test? Well, pen testing actually increases the risk by exposing systems without the ability to monitor for follow-up activity. Your findings can't be acted on because you lack the infrastructure to implement or validate fixes. Your security kind of becomes theater. You're checking compliance boxes while actual exposure remains unchanged. You accept the risk, you put it into the risk register, and now you have a record of all of those vulnerabilities within your system in a single location, but you're not actually doing anything about it. Bottom line, pen testing without readiness wastes resources and creates false sense of confidence. You need to build the foundational capabilities first, then validate them through some level of progressive testing.
So then what's the right way to do this if we're going to approach that? Let me walk through some of the correct sequences to build, validate, and test. Effectively, OT security programs follow a deliberate progression that builds those capabilities before testing them. The sequence prevents operational disruption while establishing a genuine resilience against sophisticated attacks. Here's how it works. Phase 1, you build out the foundations, establish visibility into the IT OT traffic, the east-west traffic Chris was referring to, implementing architecture segmentation, which is still a required step in these environments, and oftentimes where organizations fail. And you need to deploy the monitoring capabilities and this together creates the infrastructure needed to detect and respond to those threats. Phase 2 is to validate detection, and that's where conducting an OT red team assessment is really helpful. It helps you test whether the organization can identify and respond realistically to those attack scenarios. And this reveals the gap not just in the people and processes and technology, but goes beyond that. Phase 3 is really to improve response, and that is addressing and identifying the gaps of detection, escalation, and coordination that were identified during that testing phase. From there, you can develop the correct runbooks and build those common scenarios and cross-train the IT and the OT teams specifically around how they're going to interact together. And then you can move on to that targeted testing. Is only after you have these foundational areas, the foundational ability to detect, and you can actually start identifying the areas you need to do deeper testing and identify where you need to do those more surgical tests and work on some of the bigger systems or scenarios you might run into. Is at that stage, then you're able to contextualize and remediate. So this sequence prevents outages and breaches. Each phase builds on the confidence of the last, and you end up creating a program that reduces risks and really gives you that operational sustainability.
Now, for organizations that haven't quite met those fundamentals yet, that aren't ready for a full red team assessment, let me introduce what we call an IT/OT cyber reality check. This is a safe starting point. The reality check provides intermediate and immediate value without operational risk. It's a structured workshop approach that maps actual attack pathways through your environment using existing knowledge and documentation. No active testing, no operational risk. The reality check answers the critical question every executive should be asking themselves. If we were targeted tomorrow, how would it unfold? Here's the 5-step process. Step 1, we together map your trusted paths. You document real IT to OT connections, shared credentials, and administrative access routes. Step 2, identify feasible routes. Together, we determine which pathways attackers could realistically exploit without advanced capabilities. Step 3, no exploitation required. This is key. You gather insights through analysis and interviews. No active testing, no operational risk. Step 4, we align with the stakeholders. You bring IT security, OT engineering, and leadership together with a shared understanding of what the reality really is. Step 5, we prioritize improvements. Identify the high impact security improvements based on actual attacker feasible scenarios, the things that need to be prioritized first and then would give you the biggest bang for your buck. The reality check creates an alignment before investment, and teams consistently report that this exercise reveals critical gaps they'd operated with for years without realizing the implications.
All right, let's bring this together. And this is what we're calling the uncomfortable truth. Passing an OT pen test doesn't mean that you're safe. It means that you passed a test design for a different question. One of the focus on technical exploitability rather than operational resilience against sophisticated adversaries. The security industry has spent decades refining pen testing and the different methodologies that work in an IT environment. And the risk of disruption in those spaces is pretty low, and the systems are designed and tested for those capabilities. Now, in the OT environment, in the industrial environment, we've also spent decades refining the approach. And in the OT environment, you have to use a slightly different approach to get the same level of experience or testing that you do in an IT environment. The security industry has really come a long ways, but we're continuing to apply these new approaches and, or even applying the same approaches to an old problem and getting the same results over and over again, whereas a shift into red teaming can really change that. So the question we really want to ask is, can we see and stop and contain a real attack before it causes impact? This question shifts focus from theoretical vulnerabilities to practical capability and acknowledges that the perfect prevention is impossible, especially in complex industrial environments with decades-old equipment that has an IT network that supports it as well. So what should you be doing instead? Here's the top 3 things. First, attack path validation. That is one of the biggest areas that reveals how attacks would actually progress through your specific environment and trust those relationships. Second is the OT red teaming. Test your organization's ability to detect and escalate and respond to sophisticated attack scenarios using the same attacker techniques that an adversary would. And third is the continuous improvement. Treat security as an operational discipline requiring the ongoing measurement and fulfillment and refinement. And that really means that you need to be bringing that feedback from those reports and applying it into your processes. So these approaches answer the right questions, which is they reveal how the organization would actually defend itself when targeted, and not just whether specific vulnerabilities or theoretical could be exploited. That's the uncomfortable truth that mature security programs embrace, is looking at this not just from a specific testing procedure against a device or a segment, but actually understanding how all those trust relationships work together.
All right, that brings us to our Q&A section. We've got a few common questions here that we wanted to address, but we also want to open it up for questions from you.
So one of the first questions we're going to throw out, or we're going to answer for you, is when should we do OT pen testing? And OT pen testing is, hey Gary, you're going to be able to delete part, right? Delete this. Was this your section to start talking?
No, you're fine. Keep going.
Okay. So sorry. So when should we do OT pen testing? OT pen testing is good, again, after you've already identified the major attack paths. And if you want to dive into learning more about a specific system, say, for example, we recognize that we have a hard time protecting these specific devices or this specific software that sees more risk exposure than others. Those are areas where you could dive in and do a deeper pen test into a piece of software or even a PLC that you're most concerned about. But really the goal there, or the trick there, is to understand that OT pen testing doesn't give you a lot of the trust relationships that we're referring to with red teaming.
Great. Second question. How do we reduce testing risk? Well, we start with the IT/OT cyber reality check. Zero exploitation, all analysis. Do tabletop exercises to test your response procedures. When do you move to active testing? Start with red teaming that focuses on detection and response. Only then should you do a traditional pen test on a specific, well understood system. Progressive risk, each step building on the last.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And the third question we'll help answer is how do we explain this to our board? So I think the real trick here is, if you're looking at the world from a compliance lens, they say here's the bare minimums, and a lot of organizations, that's kind of where they stop. The reality is the risk that organizations are facing today from sophisticated attackers that are leveraging things like AI and have the ability to learn a lot very quickly. Those are risks that are still emerging. And for anybody that has OT environments or critical infrastructure, even the stuff that's hidden in the data centers that organizations run, those are risks that need to be well understood as a business, and you need to understand how you will respond to an attack in those environments, which is why a red team really helps differentiate by using those attacker tactics and techniques. It helps demonstrate your capability to detect. So that is a good approach if you need to talk to a board, is explain this gives you a better visibility into your true risk as an organization.
Perfect.
Guys, we have 3 additional questions from the audience today.
Gary, your mic sounds horrible.
Sound any better now?
Yes.
A little bit.
Okay, we have 3 additional questions from the audience today. And Terry, since you just talked about speaking with the board, I'll ask this question first. How should boards and executives rethink acceptable risk when most real OT breaches exploit trespass rather than unpatched vulnerabilities?
I think a good way to approach this is really understanding that security is one of the many outcomes that organizations should be pushing for. Understanding that visibility, understanding the data that's on those systems and how it can be leveraged as an organization for outcomes is critical going into the future, and understanding how that data is used. An attacker can demonstrate, or a pen test can demonstrate the effects on the system, which most boards aren't necessarily going to understand or care a lot about. Whereas a red team, we can come in and we understand those attackers, the adversarial tactics, use those trust relationships to demonstrate what an attacker would actually be able to do. And that it gives the visibility to the board to understand a much broader risk picture for the organization. It's some of the things that a red team does can be seen as simple. For example, collecting data. But the data you collect after you get inside an organization informs the rest of your test, and therefore informs the rest of your attack chains. Those are the sort of areas where the traditional pen testing does not necessarily get into. Is how do all those systems work together, including the people?
Okay.
Great. This one goes further into pen testing, so let's tackle this one. If penetration testing validates controls, but red teaming validates resilience, which you guys talked about, are most OT programs measuring the wrong outcome?
Gary,
Hey Gary, re-record that one. You couldn't hear you for the first part of it.
I don't know what's going on with my mic. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, here's another follow-on question for you guys. If penetration testing validates controls, but red teaming validates resilience, are most OT programs measuring the wrong outcome?
So I would say that they're not actually measuring the wrong outcome. I would say that they're measuring an outcome that has a requirement. So we turn around and we say that as part of the requirements involved with having a system, I have to have it pen tested every 6 months, right? That's a known thing that certain frameworks require, and they're necessary in order to go ahead and show that you've done the footwork to get you towards the door. It's a bit like follow-on credits. When after you've gotten your degree, but you need to go ahead and stay up to date with what's going on in the real world. The reality is, though, that understanding a vulnerability and how it might affect a single system doesn't tell you whether or not your system as a whole, the production environment, the business, can find an attack when it's taking place. They can discover it as it happens, that they can react to it quickly and stop it from spreading, and that if something were to go down, how quickly could you recover from that? And I think that realistically speaking, when we talk about doing a red team assessment, we're telling the environment, right, how to look at the attack path and become more resilient over time. What is it that you focus on so that when a breach takes place or an attack occurs, you can limit the amount of downtime and the impact on your production to be able to get back on your feet as quickly as possible. And so are we measuring the wrong things? There's a requirement for one, but I think from a business perspective, we would prefer being more resilient, being able to go ahead and keep the damage to a minimum.
Okay, we have several additional questions, but we're running out of time here. So let's end with this final question that actually talks about readiness. So the question is this: what foundational capabilities must be in place before an organization is truly ready for penetration or red teaming? And how can leaders objectively assess that readiness?
So I think that it's really important first to look at what your objectives are. Most organizations, when they're looking at what the objective of their test or their upcoming pen test, what it is, it's led by a compliance requirement. You need to assess the system. When you're looking at it from an overall perspective, though, it's important to focus on that risk reduction and not just understanding the vulnerabilities or deep vulnerabilities for one system. Again, the trust relationships are what the attackers are actually exploiting and what they're targeting. When you have a red team assessment or a pen test done, those foundational things you need to have or that would test your resilience is being able to detect what's going on there. A lot of times organizations, for example, will have a red team assessment that's bundled as part of an asset discovery component of a test, right? So a lot of organizations are still trying to figure out what they have. If they're at a point where they're still trying to figure out what they have, it's a good time to have a red team come in and help highlight, here's your critical systems, right? Whereas if you were to have a pen tester come in and look at what you consider to be a critical system, you may miss the mark. So the foundation is really understanding where you're at as an organization, being honest about where you're at as an organization from a visibility perspective, and really having that goal. For example, we want to have visibility, full visibility into these assets. So red teaming can help early on. Pen testing can still be that required step, but the red teams often can qualify as a pen test for the assessment capabilities for regulatory compliance as well, right? So you can check multiple boxes with a red team assessment versus a pen test and just get more information and more guidance on where should you implement additional controls.
All right, great. Thank you, Terry and Chris, for giving us great insight today into how attackers actually move.
Gary, sorry, can't understand anything you're saying.
Can you hear
Just
me now?
wiggle it. Every time you're about to talk, give it a wiggle. I don't know what it is.
Can you hear me
It's
now?
almost like the noise canceling.
Yes.
Something.
You good?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's going to wrap us for today. Thank you, Terry and Chris, for giving us great insight into how attackers actually move from IT into OT environments. And if you're interested in learning more about how attacks can attack your organization specifically, sign up now for a PhishCloud IT/OT cyber reality check. This is a no-cost 45-minute executive strategy session designed to show you how attackers can reach your OT environment. You'll get real clarity on real attack paths and a new way to think about IT/OT risk. You can use the QR code here to access the sign-up page. We're also making available to participants a booklet that goes into great detail on what the IT/OT cyber reality check can really deliver for you. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.